Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Discover and eliminate cyber attack pathways to critical assets with Elusive Networks Attack Surface Manager, sponsored by Elusive Networks. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackelford, SANS Analyst and CEO of Voodoo Security, and Wade Lance, Field CTO at Elusive Networks. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's always exciting to be able to come to you guys and talk a little bit about some, real experiences that we had as part of the SANS analyst team, getting the opportunity to sort of get our hands on some gear and actually sort of take a trial run through interesting technology that I think might be useful in helping people sort of further their cybersecurity initiatives. And certainly, I think today, one of the areas that, we've definitely recognized as a big issue is just being able to get a bit more proactive and get a little further ahead of the types of attack scenarios we've seen playing out over the past decade or so, really. I think we've got a reasonable understanding in the industry and certainly throughout the community of the types of attacks that we're seeing and really some of the different mechanisms by which the attackers are taking advantage of us. And the bigger problem, I think, especially in big sort of busy environments, is how do we put that to practice? How do we take some of that knowledge and put it to good use and do so in a way that allows us to find these types of scenarios uncovering in the environment, and then, of course, be able to ideally do something about that. Well, I'm happy to say, in spending some time with the folks at Elusive Networks, that they've come up with a pretty innovative way to approach this, which not only allows you to discover things that are going on in the environment, but maybe even to figure out where things could go on before they actually do. And so it's kind of a cool, I don't want to say predictive way of looking at this, but I've always been a big fan of really the concept of quote unquote what if scenarios and being able to play those out and manifest that in our environments and say, well, based on all this information we've got network data, we've got identity information and roles and privilege assignments that we have some visibility into. I mean, across the spectrum of the environment, of course, we've got local accounts, unfortunately, still. We've got things like domain and sort of, top tier directory oriented accounts. We've got administrative privileges in use. We've got all that stuff. We've also got network pathways and conduits and segmentation techniques and tactics that we can take advantage of. The question is, how do you throw all that stuff into a blender, as it were, and actually start telling stories about what might be able to happen in the environment, given this knowledge of how attacks are actually unfolding. And that's exactly what we looked at this product through the lens of, right? So I'm happy to be here to sort of hang out and give you guys a little taste of the experiences that we had in sort of evaluating things from a different standpoint and saying, well, look, we know attackers are getting more creative. We know that they're getting a little more stealthy. Some might say a lot more stealthy, but what really doesn't change is the fact that they're after some sensitive data and assets that we have somewhere in our environment. The question is, where do we find these crown jewels, as it were, within the environment, and how do we sort of label those and then build profiles and pathways around that to where we can ask ourselves, how could this happen? How could it unfold? So I think there's some threat modeling to sort of come into the mix here. And I think even more than that, it's visualization and true modeling of those attack pathways that are surfaced and sort of brought to light through the Elusive Networks Attack Surface Manager. So we find vulnerabilities that might be present in the environment through, again, exposed conduits or exposed pathways or exposed credentials or all of the above. And what we can also do with this type of tool, which I think is sort of the big deal here, right? It's great to see stuff, but the obvious question is going to arise: what are you going to do about it? And they've actually got some cool remediation capabilities that you can put into place when you discover these types of attack pathways as well. So let's sort of go through it. I'll give you guys the perspective. I actually had a lot of fun in this review, sort of going through and using the product, but also sort of going through an attack scenario. And as somebody who's done a lot of pen testing in their career, this was sort of second nature, but it's always fun to go through and sort of use some of the same classic common tools that are out there in the wild, being seen consistently as part of the attack strategies that are, unfortunately being used against us. So we had an online lab environment that was set up for us by the folks over at Elusive. And, that certainly made things easy as far as just getting started and certainly much appreciated. But we had a nice test bed that we were able to go sort of build things out. And of course, the goal of this wasn't from our perspective to go through installation of the product and what have you. It was more to see the capabilities and see them right up front. So what we did was create some attack phases. And it all started, or was predicated upon, initial ingress through an endpoint, which I think is reasonable today. I mean, unfortunate, but reasonable. We've seen this consistently happening for years. So we started there. We started with, hey, somebody's gotten onto, say a laptop or some sort of endpoint that's, maybe in use by a user with access to other assets in the environment. And what we started with was some sort of a credential sort of harvesting attack. And we used Mimikatz to do that on the Windows system here, just to be able to pull some of this out. And of course, there are other tools that you might be able to leverage in the same vein. This is just one that we chose to use to, sort of, number one, emulate fairly common and well-known attack strategies. Number two, get the data we needed. And sure enough, on the system that we compromised here, or started off with, we found some credentials that had been stored on that system. And you can see a little snippet of that right here. So, of course, any attacker, naturally, that gets a hold of credentials, which is one of the most prevalent lateral movement tactics out there, maybe the most prevalent lateral movement tactic, just given the nature of credentials floating all over the place. What we're going to do is try to use some of those, and we're going to do so across the environment. And so what we did was, as you can see, pull back a handful of credentials that look interesting, as well as the systems or domain systems that those credentials might be relevant on. And so that was our first tactic, right? We started off with access, grabbing creds, and then going through and saying, well, where could we go? So the next step for us was to go actually try to access the distinct system you see listed here down at the bottom. That's EP0354, using this TIM credential that we found. And of course, that gives us at least some access to something in the environment as long as they're valid. And so we used PSExec. And this is actually not that uncommon today, seeing more sort of traditional Windows utilities and tools and things used versus, sort of malware or other types of malicious executables or suspicious executables that might get flagged more readily. And speaking again as a pen tester, it's actually always astonishing to me that PSExec doesn't get picked up, across the board in most environments, when frankly it's probably not even something that most people need or have to use. But hey, it is what it is. So we used PSExec, and of course, the gift that keeps on giving here, we used this against that system, and we of course executed a command prompt for ourselves. So now we've got remote command access on the system, and just did a double check to see that we were in fact logged in as this, user that had authority to get there in the first place. So here we are, woohoo, I'm Tim, I'm on the system. The next thing we look at is, well, what are we going to do now? So next step for us was to actually facilitate and enable better access on that same system through RDP. And again, these are fairly well-known tactics. So, we weren't trying to necessarily create some zero-day scenario. We really wanted to see the sort of blocking and tackling that you've seen consistently out in the environment. And so we added some registry keys here just to basically enable the access we needed for RDP, and then opened up some local firewall rules to allow that service to actually get in there. So there we are. We've created RDP access for ourselves. And so what are we going to do next? Well, I think you guys guessed it. We're going to go in and log in via RDP. So we got over on RDP now that we've opened up that access. And same thing goes. What are you going to start doing as an attacker? You're going to start scouring around, looking for interesting credentials or artifacts or things of some interest that might either, satisfy the goal of illicit data or sensitive data that we want, or certainly take us further in our attack path. And in this case, it was more the latter. So we're still sort of moving along, trekking through the environment. And once we get on there, we find WinSCP as an icon sitting on the desktop. And as I think most of us have come across before, maybe some of us are even guilty of, we've got cached credentials there to facilitate easier access. And so we opened up WinSCP. We find that sure enough, there's a couple profiles already saved there to get to things. And so, of course, we're going to start playing around with those and start making use of them to continue our attack strategy. So off we go. And now we used SCP to get over to the sysfs serve 5 platform. And once we're there, again, we've got SCP, which means we've got, some access to basically upload, download, move things around to and from that system. What we did was actually upload a particular utility that allows us to potentially pull credentials out of the browser. And so we've got the ability to go in and, essentially grab stuff from cached browser creds that are sitting there. And this is actually a pretty cool utility. And there's, again, many out there that do similar things. But in this case, of course, we're looking for something that facilitates new and different access. So once again, we see we've got some sort of a, Apache GUI that's showing up there. We've got, the username and password for logging into that. And so you guessed it, what are we going to do next? We're going to go try to get into that system. And we found, sure enough, that once we got in there, we, had some ability to control things within that Apache GUI. And so we had the ability to upload content, and being the erstwhile attacker we are, we're going to upload a simple reverse shell to then try to get access to that platform from a command prompt perspective. So instead of just having a, sort of GUI open to us, we want a little bit more. There's tons of great little PHP and other web shells out there. This one's fairly simple, but gets the job done. So we upload that, go and access it. And essentially using that, we sent ourselves access to a Netcat listener that we had, sort of hanging out waiting, and a shell arrived, and off we go. So classic attack strategies, and look, it never gets any less fun as a pen tester to go through these scenarios. But in this case, the whole thing was really a means to an end, and that end was getting onto that system. And of course, all these scenarios have to have an end goal, and the end goal for us was to get access to the crown jewels, which were credit card information presented within some sort of a text file. And of course, all this is just, sort of mock data, but it's great to really just build out that attack pathway. And that's the goal here, really. We wanted to start off with this idea of creating an attack pathway, following it through, getting to an end goal system, and then, of course, taking a step back and looking at this from the defensive perspective. So the goal of this exercise, of course, was not to just go, hack around and have fun. And I will tell you, it was fun, just going through and navigating through. Anybody that's done any CTFs in their lives, it's always a good time. But really the goal for us was to, again, step back and look at the product and look at what Elusive could do to potentially prevent this, or at least detect things that we see in the environment. So, I always look at these kinds of products in the space of, sort of visualization and attack pathway mapping and so on through the lens of, tier one analysts. I'm always looking at things from the junior analyst perspective, and not to say that there's not other analysts around that could certainly dig deep into this and know exactly what's going on. But if I've got some tier one SOC team members that need to jump in, see things quickly, and start asking some questions, that's always a good thing to find that it's intuitive and readily, sort of there to jump out at me if at all possible. And I really think that the attacker view pane within the Elusive console tells a great story. I think it shows these pathways, and it just got tons of great detail for all of the stages that they can detect. And it really is that attacker view, going back to what we just walked through. It's those step-by-step lateral movement possibilities or scenarios that show System A could easily be leading to System B. System B has access to System C. Crown jewels are sitting over here. Something has access to it. And given that this was, sort of a mock environment that we were setting up and running this through, it was admittedly somewhat straightforward in said pathway. But the idea here is to sort of see all those potential branches and avenues by which attackers could gain access to things, and sort of ask what we could do to prevent that going forward. So the attacker view pane was really the beginning. But the main dashboard, sort of highlights all sorts of things that could lead to further investigation. So I went to the attacker view because I wanted to see exactly the scenario that I had just gone through and see how that had mapped out. We'll come back to that actually in just a second. But if you want to start at the beginning, like legitimately what a traditional, say, SOC operator or analyst would probably do, would probably you'd be hanging out here at the main console or have that somewhere in the background. And what you're looking for is, that equivalent of the flashing red neon sign that says, hey, this is interesting and you probably need to go and check this out. And because a big element of ASM is really discovery, it's always sort of perusing the environment and systems that it has access to look for vulnerabilities or avenues of weakness that could be exploited. And so it's highlighting systems that could be vulnerable. It's highlighting areas where privileged users do have access or are seen to reside. And it's also showing examples where lateral movement could be possible, just like the ones that we went through. So what we're seeing here is sort of the, call it the call outs, if it were, to show us those things that might be interesting to go delve into a little bit further. And naturally, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to delve in a little bit further and start looking at things like the connectivity. So for any of you guys that are sort of up on the concepts of zero trust and a lot of the discussions that are being had in the community today, I look at zero trust more as a philosophy than a technology, but it's a philosophy that entails a couple distinct pieces and parts. And those pieces and parts really are networking and identity, as well as sort of a monitoring plane. Well, if you have a monitoring and discovery plane that's capable of telling you about network connectivity and capable of telling you about identity access, it's sort of moving you in a better direction to facilitate that least privileged or limited access model that we're all sort of striving for in the first place. And that's exactly what you see here, at least in one view. So the attacker view console shows us connection opportunities. And again, this goes back to the what if scenario. Who could possibly connect to what and where? And using what sort of network avenues and services to get there in the first place. So this is just the starting point. Now you'll see, of course, this is just a big picture on the screen, but as with any good visualization engine, it's something that can be drilled into pretty readily. So, what I can't, of course, show you is the, clicking that I did thereafter that sort of took me into a little bit more detailed panes, but you can easily see where there's all sorts of network connectivity options or models presented, and I can click into those and start drilling into specific types of attack paths that might exist. And that brings us back to that attacker view. But in this case, what I'm explicitly looking at is not only where sensitive crown jewels are actually identified, and we can choose that, by the way. So we can essentially tag or label specific systems in the environment as those containing crown jewels or those that have more value or potential priority for attackers. And I think that's probably the sort of best starting point for a lot of organizations to get the best use out of a product like this, is to really say, what are the crown jewels and how do we get in and start not only discovering things around them, but labeling them specifically. And that takes time. It's not always that intuitive or simple, right? This tool is actually great at discovery and can probably help with a lot of that. But I think knowing your environment and some of the data that you're trying to protect is also, pretty important. And what we're looking at here is, with crown jewels labeled, what we could potentially do to prevent attacks from getting to those crown jewels in the first place. And what you see is, of course, an attack path, but it's an attack path that distinctly illustrates section by section or step by step where there's potential opportunity for improvement that might break that attack path or break that attack chain altogether and allow us to ideally, prevent this, not just remediate it, but actually prevent the entire attack from ever occurring in the first place. So again, defining crown jewels, definitely a big part of this. And you can easily do that through this system. You go in and basically flag those and monitor those explicitly. And naturally, once you flag something as a crown jewels type of a system, the Elusive platform actually does a great job at, sort of immediately honing in on that and looking at anything and everything that's capable of talking to that system, the potential privilege cases that could be had for getting to that system in pretty much innumerable ways. And exactly that is what I'm looking for. Right? I'm looking for, tell me everything about the system and what can get to it. and where that attack could come from and who it might actually be looking like it comes from. And so once we've done that, again, looking at those crown jewels and starting to map out attack paths, the logical thing to do is say, well, do we need them all? And, certainly as somebody that spent a long time in enterprise IT, I think, I can pretty candidly answer that usually we've got more access than we need to more assets than we need. And I think that has been borne out in so many of the different, actual breach scenarios we've seen even in the last year to 2 years. I mean, if you look at a lot of the details that just came out very recently about the big Equifax breach, and, I'm not trying to pick on anybody. Everybody's got, lots to do in the world of security. I think we can learn a lot from that, actually. There's a lot of things that were still sort of out there that just weren't getting the attention they needed. It's not that they didn't care and so forth, but maybe there wasn't enough time or people or, some of the tooling needed to actually put that level of due diligence in place. There were a lot of just gaps, things that were sitting there that shouldn't have been, open access methods that should have been closed, the list goes on. And the more help we can get in finding those and then drilling down in and saying, again, is this really needed? Is this something that we could reduce or take away without impacting production or business? I think that's a goal that we've all obviously got. So here's an example. Within Elusive, I can sort of map out or visualize the crown jewel pathways, where it's coming from, what that can get to. And then, of course, I can drill into any of those and look at the details to say, is this a service that we need? Is this a particular type of access for this user or group or role or privilege that makes any sense? Do we really need this, or is this something we can get rid of? And a great example here, and it even goes back to the simple mock scenario we walked through, is locally stored or cached credentials. And so if you find those, did we really need the SCP creds cached there? I mean, I know it's a pain to have to, actually log in or actually, enter passwords or multi-factor codes or keys or whatever, whenever we need those, but saving them locally and making it just as easy as possible for an attack scenario like this is no good. So this is a case where the Elusive Platform, ASM, can actually remediate things like those shared or stored credentials on systems that it has access to, as long as you give it the appropriate privileges. So rocket, right? I mean, the easier you can make that for me, especially if it's a standard that you have defined in your environment, I'm all for it. So this is a big sort of busy slide. And incidentally, the accompanying white paper that goes along with this webcast has tons and tons of details about not only the scenario we went through, but a lot more around some of these situations we were exploring, which of course predominantly focuses on things like privilege abuse and network access. But there's so many different types of account and privilege abuse that I just sort of listed out some of the key use cases that we were keeping in mind as we went through the review. Discovering accounts, finding local and sort of top tier domain level accounts, finding crown jewels and who can get to them, looking at shadow admin scenarios where maybe there's just over allocation of privileges, either intentional or otherwise, that would be useful to be apprised of as a security professional, right? I just need to know that these, professional type of admins have access to things and potentially have privileges that they don't even know they have, right? Like, or maybe they do, and people have set up some shadow IT that we definitely want to dispense with as well. So there's just tons of things that we looked at. And again, this is just sort of a breakdown of key areas we focused on. So discovery, accounts all over the place, auto discovery of crown jewels, ideally through defining specific patterns or maybe types of data we were after, and then remediation capabilities as well. So, again, I definitely want to be able to fix stuff when I find it. So we wanted to look for specific users too. What we saw previously was more around network connectivity and conduits, but here we're actually looking for the user side of this equation. And you can drop in a specific user or a specific credential and say, where is it? And where can it go across the entire spectrum of the discoverable environment? And that's exactly what you can see here. This particular user, Tim, has access to all sorts of stuff. And that makes us question, does Tim really need that? And maybe are there better ways to accomplish that access strategy? And we can go discover those credentials all over the place, whether they're local or even things like I said, domain credentials as well. So as long as ASM actually has access to the environment and can see what's going on, you can create tons of interesting discovery rules for pretty much any type of user or group you can imagine. Setting it up is simple. Getting it started is simple. We actually found the interface to be reasonably intuitive. It wasn't real complicated to go find the places to put these different rules and actually get them started and run through the environment to find all this stuff that we want to locate. So here's just the same example around visualization, but more focused on user pathways. So we looked at the attack pathways a moment ago, more from connectivity. This is more privilege models, but the same concept, right? So a lot of the stuff in ASM really builds around these pathways, both network-based and privilege-oriented, and having that visualization and then the ability to drill down in to say, okay, this user, maybe Tim or whoever that has access to a system, how can they get to the crown jewels from one place to the next? And again, is there a way that we could reduce some of that access as we go? And sure enough, ASM has credential remediation. You can just see a short part of the list here, right? So saved RDP credentials or mapped drives that shouldn't be mapped persistently, or shared connections, stuff saved in the browser, which we saw, saved sessions in SSH, or, again, in tools like WinSCP, as we saw. All of that can be cleaned up when you deploy this type of a product. So it's great to find it. It's great to know it. It's also great to clean it up and actually go through. And what that sort of did for me too was present not only the side of more IT and security operations, but also even more of an audit function too, where we're going out there and basically just doing continuous auditing or continuous assessment of these attack pathways and potential privilege and network access models. So if you're an auditor, or if you're in sort of an audit role, and I might even extrapolate this concept of a quote unquote audit role to just security ops that doesn't need to go change stuff constantly. I mean, that's not the goal, but you certainly want to know about things as much as you can and, have that updated constantly. And then of course you can take actions thereafter. But I think this notion of auditing is a really important one because you've got a lot of visibility, and the more visibility we've got, I think the better off we're going to be. So looking at this from a number of different perspectives, I think this is a really versatile and interesting tool that gives you not only that discovery element, and I think we've been really striving to gain better ideas of discovery over the course of the past few years in security. This is something we're all trying to get better at and find things and do so more quickly. But there's also just really cool visualization around these attack paths that I think has a lot of merit for security professionals today. We've all sort of embraced these different attack strategies, the kill chain, the MITRE attack framework, and so forth. And I feel like we've got a good sense of how and why attackers are doing some of the things that they're doing. I mean, you may never get 100% predictive, but we've seen a lot. We've learned a lot in the past few years about what's going on out there. And I think we can take that knowledge and apply it as long as we've got the tools to find our assets and then really tell us what's the most important priorities in those attack paths. And so this concept of crown jewels to me is actually kind of cool. I mean, we've been saying this for years and talking about it forever, but actually putting it to practice and saying, no, everything's important, but this is really important. Now show me everything that can talk to that and what we might be able to do about it. I'm a fan. So definitely a great scenario. Had a lot of fun going through this, and definitely found that the product was pretty easy to use and tons of really cool features and functions that I think analysts could get started with right out of the box. So again, encourage you guys to go check out the associated review that's released in conjunction with this. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Wade.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Appreciate that walkthrough. All right, so yeah, my name's Wade. I'm the field CTO at Elusive Networks, and I think Dave kind of walked through some fair detail about how ASM as a platform provides some capability in the space. I wanted to take a look at some of the broader implications of the platform. And so here we go. The first thing I want to get at is just what we're going to cover in this session. I'm going to talk a little bit about Elusive as an organization, and then we'll dig into some real world assessment results. I think this is a lot of fun. One of the things that Elusive does is goes in and perform security assessments for how organizations are positioned in this space. So we'll look at some of those results, spend a little more time digging into crown jewel discovery and prioritization and kind of how Elusive provides capability in that space. And then lastly, we'll look at ASM and how it fits into an overall Elusive capability as an anti-lateral movement platform. So here we go. Don't forget, as we're going through this, if you have questions that are coming up as we're going, feel free to enter those into the questions section, and we'll engage them towards the end of the session. So not everyone on the session may be completely familiar with Elusive. So quick note, founded back in 2014, we're about 100 people serving major industries. So we've been around for a while, and one of the things that makes us unique as a company is that our founders came out of nation state red team work. They did government work, doing red team operations, and so they had a lot of very practical experience moving through highly sophisticated networks as a part of their jobs. And so when they left that work out of the government and began to look at starting a security company, the basic question was, what would we do to stop us, right? Very successful careers in moving through organizations. And so the result of that is Elusive Networks. And so very excited about our customers, a lot of work in the financials and retailers and tech space. And so that's just a little bit about Elusive if you're not familiar with this. So down to the fun part. One of the things that we do, as I said, is we do assessments. And I think it's always interesting to actually look at, how we're doing as a security organization across the different facets of where credentials or sensitive connection strings to high value assets are laying around in the organization and how those can be leveraged. So here's a grid that discusses a set of assessments that we did across 10 different organizations. You can see the size of the organization over on the left. Some of them are smaller, I think under 2,500 systems, all the way up to in excess of 20,000 systems. And so all of these organizations have fairly mature security practice. They've got the tools you would expect. From endpoint capabilities to network capabilities, log aggregation, and monitoring and incident response capabilities. And so we ran a one-time sweep of their systems and looked for what kind of highly privileged credentials or sensitive connection strings were laying around that we could leverage. And this kind of goes to show the difficulty in the space. So in this organization, you'll note that we found 30 different instances of a domain administrator credential saved in the Windows Vault on a local host. Now, out of 2,500 to 5,000 systems, that doesn't seem like a whole lot, but in fact, 30 different ways to get at a domain admin cred is more than we want, right? That's the kind of thing that needs some help. That's not a great result, actually. We notice another organization, pretty much the same size, and introspecting their environment, only one instance. Now that's pretty good work, right? So this organization is in pretty good shape as far as managing domain admin credentials being saved locally. So there they get a real high score. That's great work. It's almost impossible for this stuff to be always clean all the time. The question is, are we rationally managing the risk? If we jump over to another facet in this exact same organization for shadow administrator accounts. Now these, shadow administrator accounts are, let's say, it's an account that is not a member of a privileged group. So this is just a standard user credential, but through ACL in Active Directory, that credential is highly privileged. As a matter of fact, it may have all the privileges of a domain administrator, but they're not actually being monitored the way we monitor the privileged groups themselves. And so in this case, this organization had 20 different instances of shadow administrator accounts operating in the environment on only 9 different hosts. So that's kind of a scary thought, is that there's not only a fair number of shadow administrators, but that multiple shadow administrator credentials are being used on the same set of hosts, because there's more creds than there are hosts by over 2 to 1. So we begin to see the difficulty of, you may be doing well in one category, but in another category, in fact, struggling and creating easy pickings for an attacker that does get a beachhead. So we'll just look at one more of these for comparison. This is an instance of stale RDP sessions based on, again, a domain administrator credential. So what's happened here is that the user with a domain admin credential has RDP'd into a remote host, and then rather than actually logging off of that remote host, they've closed the RDP client, and so now that highly privileged credential is resident in that session on the remote host, creating an opportunity. Anyone that gets access to that host and can run, Windows Credential Editor or Mimikatz or something like that would be in a position to gain access to the highly privileged credential. Here's another organization that is the same size and actually a little larger, so 10 or 20,000 endpoints in the first environment, over 20,000 in the second, and they've got this nailed, right? Their RDP policy in ADGPO is and their practices are working very well. That's an A+ right there, right? In an environment that size, not a single instance of a stale RDP session that someone could exploit. However, jumping over into the facet of local administrators, we see this is an area of fairly deep struggle. So what we found is that there are unmanaged local administrator accounts, meaning the passwords are not being managed by LAP or some kind of a PAM, LAPS or some kind of a PAM program. And that, again, 852 different instances of local administrator credentials that are being used. They're not just present, they're actually being used with recent logins. The passwords are not being cycled or managed. And note again, 852 different local administrator credentials in action on only 743 hosts, right? So now, again, we're begging the question, not only do we have kind of a fair amount of local administrator use, but we're actually doubling up where in some cases multiple local administrators, I'm not sure what the point of that is. So again, vulnerabilities without a lot of value to those as far as the operations goes. And so this is one of the things that I think Dave talked about, and we've seen that, Attack Surface Manager can be used as an audit function. As security organizations, we work hard to build policy and enforce policy, but it's very difficult to audit the effectiveness of those policies on a continuous, ongoing basis. And that's what we think ASM provides some real value. So a couple more stories in this. Very interesting find in one customer. They had about 18,000 endpoints. And what was interesting is that there was a security product that was leveraging a domain admin credential in their environment. And that product was updated through patch. And the next time that product ran, it began caching the domain admin credentials in the registry on those hosts in clear text. And again, that would be a very difficult situation to discover, except that Attack Surface Manager, Elusive ASM, is doing this kind of continuous audit. It identified those credentials on those hosts the same day that this began to happen. And they not only began an automation of cleaning that immediately using ASM, but then also informed the security vendor and said, hey, your latest patch has introduced a giant vulnerability, and they were able to turn the product off. Interestingly enough, that was our customer was the one that informed that vendor that they had this issue, and the vendor was able to put out a patch for their application and get that cleaned up and put that patch out to all their customers. And to the best of our knowledge, that vulnerability was not exploited anywhere because it was identified and cleaned. In another customer service accounts, Service accounts are really a difficult thing to manage in some environments. This organization had about 7,000 endpoints, 400 domain admins as service accounts found on servers in the data center. That's a giant opportunity, and the people that had configured that, the team that had configured that, believed that that was a necessary approach to get the job done. But by creating some visibility onto this, we were able to raise this, and the customer could have a larger organization internally about what's the best way to do this, which led to alternatives, right? And a different way was found that provided the exact same capability that they enjoyed today, but without this kind of vulnerability being present in the environment. It was just too much of an opportunity for an attacker to get access to this kind of a highly privileged credential that, because it was a service account, the password's not being managed. There's no updates happening to that credential. And then just one last one is, again, this local administrator issue. This is a larger customer, just over 150,000 endpoints, and they had the same local admin user and password on over 60% of the laptops in that environment. Count is active, and so through ASM, they were able to just reach in and automatically remediate this issue by having ASM simply just go in and disable the local administrator account. Use your domain accounts, that's fine. And so we see these kinds of situations over and over and again. And I think in larger environments in particular, not only is it difficult to get visibility to these kind of situations, but even once identified, just dealing with common local administrator accounts on a very high volume of laptops and environment would be a remediation nightmare. ASM makes that easy. The whole process completely remediated in less than an hour without anybody having to get up out of their desk and actually go wandering around to different systems. So very pleased with those kinds of results. So a couple of more things. We talked about crown jewel auto discovery. In some organizations, the terminology is HighValue Assets. I just wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper. Dave certainly touched on it, and we're excited about this. Many of our customers do have a sense of some of their crown jewels, what hosts or credentials they really care about. What's interesting is we audit these environments and we see that they tend to know some, but it's hard to say, okay, well, now what? How do I operationalize that? How do I take action? And so one of the things that Elusive approach to high value assets and crown jeweling does is that we look at dropping them into categories and subcategories to try to understand, okay, this is a high value asset, but how is it used, and what's its purpose? So for instance, you can see here, there's an internal server that's running part of the CRM platform. And we know that in this environment, everybody that uses that CRM platform connects via HTTPS. That's the appropriate interaction. And so I'm not going to get all bent out of shape or concerned about people connecting to these kinds of hosts in the CRM group if they're using HTTPS, but we can set a rule in ASM to say, I'm very curious about anybody who would save RDP credentials or SSH credentials to this host because this is a high value asset, and I'm RDP access or SSH provides a level of interaction that's just too big of a risk for someone to actually store those credentials on another system. And so that level of granularity for, who knows, maybe the policy is we actually allow people talking to our CRM platform to save their credentials in the browser. Again, that's a choice the organization can make, but perhaps for different kinds of connections, we wouldn't allow that too big of a risk. The last thing down on the bottom left, you can see this area on crown jewel suggestions. And one of the things that Elusive does is, as we're looking at interactions between systems, we start to identify systems with high levels of interaction and the kinds of interaction, and begin to suggest to the organization, hey, 1,000 people a day talk to this system using some privileged credentials. This looks like a crown jewel to us. Let's take a deeper look and see if that isn't something that you want to provide enhanced monitoring. And customers have been very excited about that particular capability. One more thing, we talked about pathways and focusing on remediation. Elusive looks at this from the perspective of choke points. How do we, understanding that this computer too has a very high level of access to this domain controller, and so you can see here that the exposure rate is 1,000 out of 1,000. That's pretty high. Notice that after cleaning, we can tell you the particular exposure rate if you provide the remediations that are suggested. And so this really gives folks a good understanding of how do we go in along the pathways to our crown jewels, identify systems that are choke points for attacker access, and then what will the results be of the cleaning. It's, in larger organizations, 100, 200,000 systems, it's going to be extremely difficult to get them all. And so prioritizing your response to these is certainly a very valuable approach. Okay, so one more thing, and then we'll move on. One of the things that ASM provides is an ongoing risk report showing how we're doing across these facets as an organization over time. The current status for this organization, obviously there is no Woodgrove Bank, but this is a real organization. And this is for a period just about a year ago, and they were generally getting about a C, 49 out of 100s with some improving generally, but they're able to dig into the different facets of how they're doing controlling credentials and sensitive connection strings and see exactly where they're improving, where they're getting worse from last month, and what the actual ratings are. So here you can see the organization's doing a pretty good job with local administrator credentials and domain administrator credentials, and that continues to get better. However, shadow administrators is not great and getting worse as our overall pathway management, and crown jewels is, I don't know how you get an F and improving, but definitely an area that needs attention. And this kind of senior level reporting, super helpful in getting a sense of how we're doing. Are we reducing our risk over time, or is this an area that needs additional attention? So the overall Elusive platform, I want to take a minute and kind of drop some ASM as a platform kind of into the overall Elusive capability. We have three primary capabilities in this lateral movement or sideways attacking, east-west attack kind of a methodology. And so Attack Surface Manager is really our preemption capability, where we simply go in and identify low-hanging fruit for insiders and attackers in the environment, identify it and clean it. Simply deny the attacker the goodies that they use to move easily through the environment. That's Attack Surface Manager we've been talking about today. There are a couple of other capabilities we're pretty excited about, is we also have a detection platform for when someone attempts to move between systems, when someone attempts to move laterally using what appears to be privileged credentials or sensitive connection strings. This gives us a way to deal with the leftovers, right? Because in most environments, ASM can't clean everything. People do need access. There'll always be leftovers. Environments are always changing and new systems coming and going. And so how do we deal with the leftover access? And we do that through our attack detection system, which is based on a deceptive methodology. We're pretty excited about that. I'm going to have one more slide. We'll talk about that. Then we also have a response capability. What do we do when we detect this kind of lateral movement event in the space? How do we respond to it and pull that data out with real-time actionable forensics directly off the source of the attack behavior? And so one of the things that gets excited about the Elusive capability is as Dave said, it's very easy to manage, very scalable, obviously to larger or even smaller environments, and very high fidelity. We're not a noisy system. It's when we throw an alert saying, hey, we're seeing a lateral movement attempt, it's usually a pretty serious indication of malicious operation. And so people tend to take action. We're heavily integrated into the existing security environment. So we leverage the tools that you've already got in place to create a holistic solution. So one quick slide on the attack detection system. We're back over to attacker view, which is really, as Dave kind of talked about, one of the more fun interfaces in the system. How does the attacker see my environment? And you can see here a series of hosts. Now, I'll just tell you kind of the legend. Everything here in white is real, right? The little desktop icons, those are production systems. The white connections between them are potential to interact. That's actually there, something we couldn't clean. But everything in orange is a deceptive data point that we have dropped into that environment, meaning that as an attacker looks at this environment and introspects hosts gathering credential and connection data, the vast majority of the credentials and the connection strings that they find on the production systems are in fact planted deceptions. And fundamentally what we've done is and look, we all know this, if an attacker gets access to a system in our environment and they use only the credentials that are on that system, and they go just to systems that host, that beachhead has been to before, using the exact same methods at the same time of day and move about the same amount of data, it is very difficult to differentiate that behavior from normal. And so really in security teams, finding this kind of behavior is kind of a big data problem for us as security teams. Really what Elusive has done is turn the tables on the attacker and give the attacker a big data problem. Now, when they land on a host and they gather the credential and connection data off of that host, the majority of that data is deceptive. And if they use any piece of the deceptive data, they get detected and we're able to respond and clean that system. So it's a unique approach that we really like, very much focused on less of a honeypot approach to deception and much more of a production system, right? Fundamentally pushing the deception story right down to the production systems themselves in a way that doesn't interfere with normal user behavior. So that's the story. Appreciate your time. It was a pleasure. I want to thank the SANS team for all their hard work and serious engagement. And so we'll just look forward to entertaining any questions that folks have at this point.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, what factors go into deciding what is a crown jewel? If I ask several different people on my security team, they will all give different answers.
So I'm sure Dave has got a lot of experience in this space as well. I'll make a comment. We've had this exact experience, right? If you go ask 4 different teams what the crown jewels are, that they'll all have a different answer, and chances are they're all right? The issue is that application teams or server ops or IT teams, they know what their crown jewels are, but organization-wide, that's a harder thing to determine. And so we gather that data from the different teams as we're deploying Elusive. But what we found is that, just coming to people and say, hey, tell me what all your crown jewels are, sometimes they're not, people are busy. And so what we tend to do is just run the Elusive platform, run ASM in the environment, and it will automatically suggest a list of crown jewels. Now, we can go back to those teams and say, hey, I've identified these systems. Elusive thinks that they're sensitive because they're running databases that a lot of people connect to. They're pushing a lot of data back and forth. They run sensitive IT infrastructure like Active Directory. They follow the naming convention of some of your other systems you told us were crown jewels. But if we give them that information, then they go, oh, well, no, that's not a crown jewel. That's something that we need to deprecate and take offline anyway. But actually, these other 3 are. And so That's been very helpful in our experiences. If we kind of prime the pump and make suggestions based on how Elusive sees the systems being used, then I think the security teams or the operational teams do a better job of picking out what's a priority to them.
All right, thanks. Dave, do you have anything to add, or should I move on?
No, I think that's a pretty good breakdown, honestly. I would probably say the same thing.
All right, thanks. What makes your deceptions believable enough to fool attackers into engaging with them? Don't they have honeypot buster?
Right. So yeah, this is, we get this question a lot, and as I said, our deception method is really not honeypot based, right? What makes our deceptions believable is that if you think about it, what Elusive is doing is scanning production hosts and gathering metadata about the credentials and the connection strings that are resident on that system. So we've got a very good understanding in the environment of who goes where and what credentials they use and what kind of systems they interact with. And so on the Elusive management servers, the system, I won't call it artificial intelligence or machine learning, but it's a pretty sophisticated algorithms that use gaming theory to tell a story. Our deceptions aren't random data. It's a story that's being told as if our customer's organization is just larger than it is. There's more servers with more applications, with more privileged users performing these interactions. And so when we plant this history on the production systems of interactions between production systems and the quote unquote deceptive environment, that history is totally relative to the organization, to the OUs, and right down to the individual host, right? And it changes over time. It's constantly being refreshed based on user behavior. I'll give you one example. When Elusive looks at my system, it notices my browser activity. Browser's, the world's favorite client. And so it notices my browser activity and it follows that behavior. So if I'm using Chrome today and Elusive plants deceptions on my system into my browser history, it's going to do it in Chrome. However, if tomorrow I switch over to Opera and start using a different browser, the system sees that change in my behavior and then just automatically adapts to that and starts telling a story as of, okay, now I'm using that browser to interact with these deceptive entities. And of course, we do that in a way that the normal user will never see the deceptions that are planted on the host. But the important thing is that the system automatically adapts to changes in behavior. And this is why we participated in over 100 tier 1 red team exercises against everybody up to and including the NSA red team. And we've never lost one of those challenges because it's just so difficult to differentiate between normal user behavior and the deceptive history that we plant on these systems.
All right, thank you. How do your tools protect the credentials and information they gather? If your tool was compromised, wouldn't it expose the crown jewels?
Great question. Great question. So, like every other security tool out there, we've got our own security best practices for how it is that our tool is managed, right? And so there's a whole hardening guide that goes into how it's configured. We actually control access to the Elusive platform with privileged account management platforms like CyberArk and others in order to make sure that the people that have access to it are the people that we want. We highly encourage people to use two-factor authentication in that process. And so like every other host monitoring or security system, there's a best practices guide. We've never had an incident of compromise, and our people have a pretty good sense based on their past about how that kind of thing is done. And so thankfully, no issues today. We feel pretty good about that capability.
All right, thanks. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dave and Wade, for your great presentation, and to Elusive Networks for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.